Think Tank, der Podcast von Avenir Suisse. In der Denkfabrik zu Gast. Mit Marc Lehmann.
Our guest today is the Right Honourable Liz Truss, Member of Parliament, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Welcome, Ms. Truss. We are very pleased to have such a distinguished visitors here at our think tank. Well, what is it that brought you here?
I'm here in Switzerland to talk about how we increase growth in Western societies. How do we make the case for free trade, free enterprise, and how do we fight back against the growing size of the state? How do we make our arguments so that we are able to bring prosperity to future generations? Because we have been through a difficult period after COVID, and what we need to do now is to make sure that we are giving people the power over their own lives and we are able to build those free societies.
And why have you chosen our think tank for let's say, initial discussion after you arrived to Switzerland? A few minutes after your arrival at the airport, you just visited us. Why is it?
Your think tank shares the beliefs that I have, which is that the free societies, democracies, free trade is the best way to ensure human progress.
Yeah.
But regrettably, we're not seeing that at the moment. We're seeing fewer people live in democracies than they did 30 years ago. We're seeing trade, or the speed of trade deals slowing down. So what I'm keen to do is to come here to Switzerland to talk about how we can work together to make the case for freedom and free markets.
Were we able to inspire you in any way?
Well, there were lots of great
things.
I think the Swiss canton system is very interesting in terms of giving more power to people in local areas. I see what the Swiss are doing on trade is very exciting. I'm pleased that we are, I believe, working on a new trade deal with Switzerland. And I think there are great opportunities for the Swiss-UK relationship there.
Yeah. I think we have an easy job here with you because you're known for your liberal ideas. You were even a member of the Liberal Party at your student times and then changed to the Conservatives.
Well, I discovered they weren't very liberal and they believed in higher taxes, which is why I joined the Conservative Party. And I'm a believer that the more power you give people over their own lives, the more you give them the ability to make decisions and have a bottom-up society. That is the best way to gain the prosperity that we all aspire to.
Well, I heard that you obviously come from a rather left-wing family, so that must have been a very hard childhood.
Well, my parents are great, but the fact is that they were members of the CND in the 1980s. They were on the left of politics. But I grew up in a time where we saw a real threat from the Soviet Union. And then we saw, thanks to the tough actions of Margaret Thatcher, of Ronald Reagan, of the Western Alliance, that we saw that system, which was an oppressive system, collapse. And we saw freedom restored in countries like Poland, the Baltic states. And that was a very, very exciting time. And I realized at that point that to deal with authoritarian regimes, you need to show strength. And of course, that's about military strength. But it's also about showing that our system delivers for people better and that it delivers prosperity and freedom. And that is what helped win the Cold War. It was the attractiveness of our way of life combined with the tough messages that were put out from Western politicians that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And why do you think, you mentioned that now fewer people live in democracies, fewer than 30 years ago. Why do you think this is the case, that democracy has not fulfilled its kind of promises? Or why do you think that authoritarian regimes are becoming stronger?
I think sometimes it's because people have forgotten the lessons of history. And in the 1990s, it was proclaimed that we had the end of history and that we could take our foot off the gas and just focus on our lives domestically. And I don't think we did enough to challenge Russia when Vladimir Putin was clearly taking aggressive action towards his neighbours. I don't think we did enough to challenge China. I think it was a mistake to allow China into the World Trade Organization on developing country terms and not really hold China to account for its transparency or subsidies or all of those types of behaviour that essentially undermine free markets. So I think it was a combination of us being complacent. But we've now got a generation of people living in our democracies in places like Britain who, the threat of communism isn't. I remember when I was growing up in the 80s, it was a real threat that the USSR would somehow dominate. And that threat receded. And I fear that we became complacent as societies. And, of course, with the appalling war taking place in Ukraine, perpetrated by Russia, that threat has now re-emerged.
Let's touch a few current topics, ma'am. Britain stepped out of the European Union. From the point of view of your liberal convictions, would you rate Brexit as a success or a failure?
Well, I support what we're doing. I think it was a huge decision by the British people, and it was essentially a decision that we would be making our decisions at home in Britain rather than being told what to do by the European Union. I think we now have to deliver on that. And even, 7 years after the vote to leave the EU, we've still got most of those EU laws on our statute books. So I think we need to do more now to do things differently and to deliver on the potential of the EU. Not of the UK. I am very proud as Trade Secretary that I secured the Australia deal, the New Zealand deal, and started the negotiations to join the CPTPP. I think that will prove to be of huge benefit to the UK. But inevitably, trade, it takes years to build up. It takes years to develop those business relationships. So it's still early days in terms of delivering on those opportunities.
What about the European level? How realistic is it to establish, let's say, better rules than the EU without creating additional hurdles for British companies in their dealings with their most important trading partners on the continent?
Well, I think we've got to look at the future. And the fact is, it's the economies in Asia that are growing the fastest and where the biggest growth opportunities are for business. And also the United States and the Americas as well. So you can't just look at trade as it is now. You've also got to look at trade as it is going into the future. And of course, the EU is an important relationship. We have a trade deal with the EU. But I don't think we should allow that thinking to dominate what the UK does. I think we have to look at the global opportunities for the UK.
But you were initially an opponent of the Brexit in the pre-referendum campaign. What made you a supporter of the Brexit?
Well, first of all, I'm a Democrat, and the British people voted to leave the EU. But also, I was originally concerned about disruption immediately after the vote. That disruption didn't happen. And I then saw the opportunities they were, particularly on trade. But also, during COVID, we were able to do things differently on the vaccine. We've been able to, I think, lead in areas like foreign policy because we were less constrained. So it was a clear decision made by the British public. It gives us the ability to do things differently.
But you mentioned, Ms. Truss, Britain is more than Europe, thinks big, so to say, has always had a global perspective. What is the current status of the UK's portfolio of, let's say, free trade agreements?
So in terms of, we've got all of the deals that we had when we were part of the EU. We've either replicated or expanded on those deals. So, for example, we've got a deeper deal with Japan. We've also secured deals with Australia and New Zealand, and we've now acceded to the CPTPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we've got a lot of the world now is covered by trade deals with the UK.
Is the UK ready to...
And Switzerland, of course.
And Switzerland, exactly. We talk about that. Is the UK ready to talk about all market entry barriers, such as, for instance, agriculture, fishery, financial markets?
So the deal
or are there
with...
limits, red lines?
Well, see, I mean, this is really a proper question for the Trade Secretary. But I think we showed in the Australia deal, by the fact we were able to negotiate a liberalising deal, including on agriculture, that the UK is a country that believes in free trade and is prepared to look at all of those areas. And we've fulfilled the terms of the CPTPP, which has very strong chapters in areas like digital, in areas like financial services. So I think we've demonstrated that we are a free trading nation.
What is the UK's position in the dominating conflict between the US and China?
We are very clear that China is a strategic threat to the United Kingdom and indeed freedom and democracy. And we're working very closely with our allies to make sure that we are reducing our strategic dependency on China, but also deepening our relationship with allies. And I mean, I was recently in Taiwan, reassuring the Taiwanese about the UK's public support for, their continued existence as a free democracy.
We talk here in Zurich, Ms. Truss. On the world stage, Switzerland is a small player, at least politically. Economically, it carries a bit more weight. How does the UK view the Swiss?
Very positively is the answer. We've already got a trade deal. I know we want to get an even better trade deal with Switzerland. I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from Switzerland about the economy in particular. And devolution, I think, is another area where there's a lot to learn from the Swiss experience. And Switzerland is another leading free democracy, another country with a relationship with the EU. So I think there's a lot more we can do to work together.
You mentioned the talks on the FTA. They have started. What should be the minimum goal?
Again, I'm not going to interfere in what is the trade negotiations.
Sure.
That wouldn't be right. But look, I want us to get as ambitious a deal as possible. I mean, our aim with the Australia deal was that it should be as easy to trade with somebody in Australia as it is with somebody else in the UK, and that's what I think. Closed partners, free democracies, that should be our aspiration.
And how can, especially the financial centres, which are both important, London, Zurich, Geneva, and also university research and development benefit from each other?
I think we've got a lot to learn. I mean, I believe in competition. I believe that we're at our best when we have to compete with each other, and that encourages everybody to raise their game. I think that's important. But I think there are areas where, such as scientific collaboration and research, where we could be doing even more together. In areas like life sciences, clearly Switzerland and the UK are both very strong. Financial services were both very strong.
If you think back a year, it was a turbulent time for you personally. You ran for the party chairmanship of the Tories. You prevailed. You became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, but only for a short period. How do you look back on this time?
Well, it was a very momentous time for me. It was a momentous time in our country's history, of course, with the passing away of Queen Elizabeth II. As I've said, I firmly believe in policies that promote more opportunity, people being able to make their own decisions, low taxation, high growth. It didn't work out last year. I had a setback, but I have not given up in promoting these ideas, because fundamentally, I think that's what will help our country and indeed this country move forward.
You're still a member of Parliament. What is your political agenda? I mean,
I've said what my political agenda is. It is about promoting free markets, freedom, and democracy. And I think we've got a job on our hands.
You mentioned the meeting with the Queen Elizabeth. You were appointed by her shortly before her death. What kind of meeting was that? What kind of memory do you have?
Well, it was a very special meeting, and she was incredibly alert right to the end. And I think serving for 70 years as the Queen of the United Kingdom is an amazing achievement.
Where will the United Kingdom stand in about 10, maybe 20 years, when I may say Scotland is in the EU, Northern Ireland and Ireland in close cooperation, Wales independent, and England completely on its own? Or join the Swiss Federation, maybe?
So my view is that in 10, 20 years' time, that the whole process of the UK establishing its own independent laws will have been completed, that we will have closer trading relationships with the rest of the world, that we will have dealt with some of our issues that are holding back growth, whether it's our planning system and the houses we need to build, whether or not it's the making sure our financial services are competitive. So I think we've got a very positive future, but I think we need to make tough decisions in order to do that.
Liz Truss, thank you very much for your visit.
Thank you.